This show is such a fresh breath of air from the MCU. The thing about this show that gives it more leverage compared to the other shows is honestly because of how much I didn't know who Moon Knight was. I mean, I've seen him in the Midnight Suns comics, but in those, he's essentially just a superhero with a bird guy that controls the moon. But this show really knew how to delve such a fantastic character. I think Moon Knight is one of the best origin stories they've had in the MCU. It's kind of amazing that despite what you first assume the Disney Plus series will be about, they're all about an exploration into something much more real. WandaVision is about grief. Falcon and the Winter Soldier is about race and geopolitics. Loki is about getting second chances and learning to love himself and care for others. Hawkeye is about dealing with trauma, and Moon Knight is on the surface about warring gods, but it's actually about the struggle with mental illness. I had never heard of dissociative identity disorder before watching this show, but it made me want to research it and find out more about what it is. And the fact that the human mind can do things like that, where when they're young and they feel like this just emotional or physical abuse around them and they can just create another identity or alter to use it as a coping mechanism. I'm glad that from what I saw on the internet, the people with DID felt comfortable with how the show dealt with it. The writers seem to have portrayed the serious effects of abuse and mental illness while keeping in mind to respect for those who go through it. Mental health isn't represented in the correct way on a lot of TV and movies, and like Oscar said in some interviews, it's usually the villain that have the mental health issues and they're portrayed as crazy and delusional. This show changed that. Mental health doesn't mean crazy. In some cases, it's a superpower. This was an MCU property that didn't feel like it was using the franchise's past to build its identity. Episode 1, The Goldfish Problem, is such a great episode. Something I really love in this show was all the unique camera angles and the use of reflections in the water, mirrors, window, making the audience feel uneasy as to what is real. Throughout this episode, you genuinely don't know what's going on, but you definitely know you're in it for the ride. But I think the main reason I'm even talking about this show is the one and only Stephen Grant. I like how they literally wrote the guidebook on how to write a character that wins all of our hearts within literally 2 seconds. Like, that's Stephen. That's Stephen.
Hello.
He's without a doubt the most lovable character you will ever encounter. Like that scene when he's at that steak restaurant, you can literally see his soul start to deteriorate. It's just absolutely heartbreaking. Oscar Isaac deserves a lot of credit for making us love a pretty unknown comic book character. There's no Oscar Isaac in his characters the way there is an RDJ in Tony Stark or Anthony Hopkins in Odin. He just becomes his characters so flawlessly. Oscar Isaac, more like Oscar worthy. The ability to switch between 3 personalities with a level of finesse and intensity is mind-blowing, to say the least. Episode 2, Summon the Suit, was pretty good. I mean, if I'm being honest, it would kind of meander in a couple of areas, but definitely the highlight of that episode was Ethan Hawke. Arthur Harrow is such an interesting villain to me. The concept of him being like an entity in human form that makes a judgment and takes souls instantly that fail the judgment even before they commit the sin, that's pretty damn interesting. Episode 3, The Friendly Type, I heard a lot of people didn't get into it, but I thought it was an absolute blast. I may be biased because I'm Egyptian, but I was so pleased that Muhammad Diab was involved in this because Egypt is always depicted in movies or series as a place in medieval times. And he's notoriously known to make films in such an atmosphere where you feel every bit of his direction, like Cairo 678 or Clash. But what I really liked here is that anyone that travels to Egypt or just lives in Egypt can relate to the places that are shot. It gives another layer of authenticity to the places in Egyptology used in this series from a different and more genuine perspective. And another thing that I loved in this episode and in this entire show was May Kelamewi. She absolutely nailed it as Layla, the first Egyptian superhero. She's basically like the Cleopatra of this series, and by the end, basically an Egyptian Wonder Woman, and I'm here for it. I really hope to see more of her. Episode 4, The Tomb, aka the episode where your love for Stephen is unquantifiable.
Sorry, Mr. Great. You shocked he goes to? us.
Everything about it felt creative, the set design was really cool. And then we get to the ending, which when I first watched it, I think the best word for that part would be bizarre? Hi. But anyway, if I'm being honest, this is a pretty underrated episode. Episode 5, otherwise known as Asylum, is, in my opinion, the best episode of any of the MCU shows so far. They were really able to dig deep into the emotional realm and trauma that lies within the show. I loved the creative use of camera cuts because it puts you in Marc and Steven's shoes. The fact that Marc's mom went from kind and loving to a drunken, abusive parent clearly shows that it was a mental health issue. The terror of losing a son is more than enough to damage someone, but on Marc's side, you can feel that emotion. That emotion of just being a kid, feeling hated, feeling alone, with no one out there to fend for him, which all leads to the pinnacle of high caliber acting by Isaac. This scene. This, in my eyes, is one of the best scenes that the MCU has ever made. It's not the most heroic, it doesn't have any epic music or legendary characters, but the pain Oscar made everyone feel here in these 20 seconds is what makes it incredible. Seeing Marc's emotional response here, the desperate attempt to suppress his emotions, the spiteful muttering to himself, he made you feel every emotion just like you were going through it with this character. One thing I love about this show is that most of the time in Marvel, the tragedy comes from a supervillain, that whole "We'll meet again, Spider-Man!" kind of trope, but for Marc, it's tragically mundane. This feels like a real human that has realistic struggles. I think he wasn't crying for his mother, I think he was crying for himself. He doesn't want to give his mother the satisfaction of being broken by her, because the only peace she had was to abuse him to avenge the son she lost. Marc learned to repress and turn off his emotions as a child, but now she's gone. And he can't cope with the hurt he suffered, leaving him with guilt and pain while she's at rest. You know he wants to tell her something like, "I was just a little boy," and absolve himself of the responsibility for his brother's death, which is essentially his fault, but definitely not his intention. But she's gone, and now he can never get that closure for the hurt and rejection he felt for all those years. And that's how we get Steven, the fictional, optimistic, non-confrontational version of Marc who has a loving relationship with his mother, the one Marc never had. He doesn't have to fix his relationship with his mother because she's still alive and they're really close. The thing I especially love about Oscar's acting in this episode is how well he does the DID. I've actually seen that video of Anthony Padilla interviewing people that have DID, and sometimes it is literally just a subtle drop of the mouth or eyes opening so wide to show an alter has taken over. I think this is just one of the many testaments to how well Oscar understood all of the characters he played in this show. Episode 6, Gods and Monsters, could have been better. There's something about these Disney Plus shows to me where, with the exception of Loki, the finales are always the worst episodes. And that doesn't by any means make this episode bad, but I think the best word to describe this finale was that it was just so rushed. Like, the entire action scene in Egypt was fantastic, Marc and Steven finally coming to terms with one another is great, Layla being even more amazing than she was and having her own avatar is so rad. This one scene that cements Steven as my favorite MCU character. I mean, look at the drip! I mean, after that end credits scene, it really feels like an endless amount of opportunities. But either way, the episode was good, I guess, but it genuinely needed more weight because wow was it short. But anyway, I really hope there's a second season. Now that he's seemingly made amends with Steven and freed himself from Khonshu, it's now a perfect time to bring Jake Lockley into the fold. Imagine, it would be something we have never seen in the MCU before. Marc's two biggest weaknesses combine to form the ultimate threat. Seeing Marc's exterior abuser working hand in hand with the darkest part of himself is perfect writing. Unlike every other Marvel show, Marc can't just punch away this problem, he is forced to live with it for the rest of his life. Not gonna lie, that sounds pretty cool. Moon Knight really is my kind of show. It's my cup of tea, if you will. With the other shows, because we have a clear idea of who they are, and we have this expectation and anticipation for it, and even if they're good, they're not really breaking any boundaries. This show is the embodiment of breaking boundaries. Its uniqueness makes it stand out from the MCU crowd. It felt more like a story of an addict, that even with progression, or better yet, huge progression, there's always a battle. I don't know, I just think there's a real beauty in that the journey isn't done, and I really hope they continue with Moon Knight down the road.